Uh, Good evening. My name is John LaFurla, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you here this evening to this Brody Center Forum. This is going to be a tremendously educational event for me, and I'm sure for you as well. And I'm going to speak only for a minute because my job is to introduce the moderator, who then will introduce the speakers. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator this evening, who is a professor at the School of Social Policy. He does research on program evaluation and anti-poverty programs. And Doug has been the moderator, believe it or not, of all of the Brody Forum events going back nearly 20 years. So without further ado, I give you Doug Besheroff.
John, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Well, redistricting, sometimes called gerrymandering, because an early example of a results-driven district was drawn to look like a salamander. And the person who designed it was a guy named Elbridge Gerry. And so it is not surprising that this has a long and venerable history of politicians choosing their voters instead of the voters choosing their politicians.
You know, it's one thing to exercise the right to vote. It's another thing to proactively defend your democracy. And I think that's what you're doing here tonight, is defending your democracy and understanding that it's not just about voting, but it's also being a part of the process that develops who you can vote for and who the citizens of the state will be voting for, and what communities get to stay together and what interests get to stay together. So redistricting is a very important issue, and I'm happy to join in the fight and in the struggle. I want to talk a little bit about the redistricting effort or the redistricting process in Maryland. So why do we redistrict? To ensure that every person's vote is worth the same as another, and to assure equal opportunity to elect representatives of individuals' choices. What that did for our state is it left us in a horrible predicament where we had some of the most gerrymandered districts in the country. And in fact, I'll read you a statement from a case that was filed against the state of Maryland. I can tell you that Judge Titus, in his concurring opinion, did point out something very interesting. Said it is clear that the plan adopted by the General Assembly of Maryland is by any reasonable standard a blatant political gerrymander. Congressional District 3 is particularly offensive for several different reasons. It probably defies most logic in terms of how it's drawn. It certainly divides communities of interest, and it egregiously goes into Montgomery County. The district's actually based in Baltimore and in the Baltimore region, but because the party decided that they wanted to shore up the 3rd Congressional District so that there was, no opportunity for fair competition there, they decided to grab Democratic votes in Montgomery County. They grabbed safe Democratic votes, and the reason why I say that is because they picked up minorities, specifically in Montgomery County, in order to make a Baltimore-based district a safe district. If we did have, and I think we should adopt national standards, in particular for our congressional representatives, because everything else is driven by federal law. So I think coming up with some standards really would help to bring some sanity to us as a state when we're drawing these lines.
And the Congress of the United States right now has a very bad incentive system. And that's because of the gerrymandering process that's gone on in the redistricting. And in fact, about 80 to 85% of the districts in the United States are considered safe districts, which means there is no real challenge during a general election. So some estimates as much as 85%. This year is probably closer to 80%. Whether it's 80 or 85%, those individuals have an incentive. They may not do it, but if they follow their incentives, and we have to assume a vast majority of people will act to some degree on their incentives. Their incentive is to only talk to half of the country And in fact, because of the number of people who vote in primaries, which is embarrassingly low, their incentive, quite frankly, is to speak to the more active members of that half of the country, if you will, which is why we have such a polarized Congress, which is why the 500 people in the Congress of the United States behave dramatically differently than all the other human beings in the world.
We're going to talk about a few different models for redistricting reform. One is going to be the independent commission model. California has kind of the most independent system in the country, but there are other variations on that, so we're going to take a look at those. We're going to talk about states like Florida, in which the legislature still draws the lines, but they are restricted in their ability to gerrymander by constitutional requirements. A bipartisan politician commission is also a possibility, and we're going to look at very quickly at New Jersey, how that works. And then finally, Iowa has a unique model in the United States in that a nonpartisan legislative research entity does the drawing of lines. So
with changing the process. Whatever the merits of your proposal, and I'm actually in favor of all three of those things there, I think you'd probably concede that at the moment the likelihood of your bill passing in this Congress is probably slim to slim. And therefore, if we're not going to have federal reform, it means changing the process at the state level. Can you talk about how that change has occurred, and what can folks in Maryland do to bring about change here?
Well, some of the examples, will simply don't apply in Maryland, like Arizona, California, or ballot initiative states. But in other places, there was sufficient public pressure, like Washington State is one, in which it was the legislature that implemented a change. In Iowa, the legislature decided that they didn't want to do be the line drawers. And I think there's public pressure because it's there are ugly districts that demonstrate a desire to protect incumbents, to protect party advantage. And I'd actually ask the delegate to speak to this. I don't know that drawing lines is a particularly pleasant process, but in the end, it's these gatherings to make sure that a topic that is somewhat arcane to many in a state, to make sure that they are aware that this really cuts at our fundamental rights to fair representation.
So I think this issue is a perfect issue for a real big national movement. And maybe the best issue out there, right? There's a lot of things we all want to change in government, right? But this issue is really about the people versus the government, right? Full stop. It's about the entrenched interest versus the interest of the common good of the United States, more than any issue. And to argue against some of this stuff is an utterly indefensible position. You cannot stand up in front of citizens and argue for not some reform here. You can't do it and look halfway credible. So what the citizens have to do is push people. You really have to push people hard. And we have to figure out some way of mobilizing a movement here in Maryland and hopefully across the country. Because this is one where the people can really make a difference. Because unlike these other issues that, yeah, we should do tax reform. But let's face it, there's 400 items of tax and there's 300 items of deduction. A lot of things are easier said than done. People can make arguments on both sides. This is a really clean case and a clean cut. And we just need more people to focus on it, and we can make a difference on this one.